My name's Charles Ziegler. I'm the faculty director for the Grawemeyer World Order Award. And I am first going to introduce some of our honored guests today before we get started, before I do the introduction for Dr. Strauss. First of all, we're very pleased to have some members of the Grawemeyer family here. If you would just wave or stand if you'd like. Give them a hand, would you? So, Charlie Grawemeyer is no longer with us, but we're very glad that his family could be here. Also, I'd like to recognize my boss, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Kimberly Kempf-Leonard, who just made it in. And next to her is the Executive Director of the Grawemeyer Awards, all 5 of them, Dr. Charlie Leonard. And finally, I'd like to recognize, I think she's hiding in the back, Dr. Jasmine Ferrier, who's the Chair of Political Science. And also just a brief shout out to Dr. Roger Payne, who ran this award for 17 years prior to my taking it over. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Grawemeyer Award, because even winners, I found today, are a bit in the dark as to how the selection process is carried out. It takes virtually a year, folks. We put out a call for nominations in November, December of a year, and then in January and February, the nominations come in and supporting materials, generally books, but sometimes articles, sometimes reports. We've had websites nominated. It is for an idea, right? Because that's what Charlie Grawemeyer wanted to reward, ideas that might somehow improve world order. So the nominations come in, I screen them. Virtually all are very solid at this point. We've achieved a reputation worldwide, I might say, for having good quality awards. And so we don't get too many that are sort of strange nominations, let's see. So then I'll send each of the books usually out for peer review, find experts in the particular field, send it out to them, and they could be up at the University of Toronto, or it could be at University of San Diego or New Mexico State or wherever. And they review those and then send back evaluations. When we get all those, then the Department Grawemeyer Committee, which consists of our experts on international politics and comparative politics, we meet usually at 3 different meetings in May. We go over the reviews, we do a triage, and we finally whittle it down to 6, 7, possibly 8 of the top entries, and then we select a distinguished international jury. I'll approach people. Most recently had people from Stanford, Harvard, and a former ambassador to 2 countries from the US. Gives you an idea of the sort of people, caliber that we get. They then either choose a winner or they rank them. I give them some flexibility. But then after that, we have the Presidential Selection Committee, which consists of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Chair of Political Science, Dr. Leonard as Director of the Awards, and at least 3 lay people from the community. It could be bank presidents, head of a local NPR affiliate, lawyers, and so forth. Because Mr. Grawemeyer wanted the award to be readable, to be intelligible to the average educated layperson, not just something for specialists. And they then make the final selection. And then I have the privilege, and it's really nice. I've done a lot of administrative things over my career. Some of them are not too fun, but it is really nice to call somebody up and say, guess what? You've won $100,000. That is fun to do. And it was fun to contact Dr. Scott Strauss and tell him that he was a recipient of the 2018 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. And that is for his book, Making and Unmaking Nations, War, Leadership, and Genocide in Modern Africa. It is a serious topic, the topic of genocide, but he is certainly more than qualified to tell us about it. We are excited to have him as a winner. Let me give you pretty quickly his biography and then turn it over to him because I know you want to hear him rather than me. Dr. Strauss is VLA's Distinguished Achievement Professor of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also serves as Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies of Political Science. He specializes in the politics of genocide, political violence, human rights, and African politics. His books, in addition to the award-winning Making and Unmaking Nations, which, by the way, has won several other awards, include Fundamentals of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, which was published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has published several books on Rwanda, including The Order of Genocide, Race, Power, and War in Rwanda, which was in 2006, and then Remaking Rwanda, State Building and Human Rights After Mass Violence. Another book was called Intimate Enemy, which was published also in 2006, and he co-authored a book, Africa's Stalled Development, published in 2003. And finally, he co-edited with Stephen Stern, The Human Rights Paradox, published in 2014. He's also published in a number of the very top journals in political science, the American Journal of Political Science, Perspectives on Politics, Foreign Affairs, World Politics, Politics and Society, Journal of Genocide Research, and many others. He's received fellowships from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the National Science Foundation, Social Science Research Council, and U.S. Institute of Peace. He was awarded campus-wide William H. Kirchhofer Distinguished Teaching Award, and in 2015, a Distinguished Honors Faculty Award. He was named a Winnick Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial in 2011, and in 2016, December, he was appointed to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council by President Barack Obama. He co-edits the book series Critical Human Rights with Stephen Stern, and before he started in academia, he was a freelance journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya. Please join me in welcoming our 2018 Grawemeyer World Award winner, Dr. Scott Strauss.
Well, I am truly overjoyed to be here. Almost speechless. It's hard for a professor to be speechless, but when I, got the call from Chuck, it just really was an unimaginable honor for me, and other people that have won this award, I just feel incredibly honored to be in their company. And so I thank Chuck for organizing it. I thank the Dean for her support, and of course the Grawemeyer family and the vision of Charlie Grawemeyer for creating this award, and to all of you for coming. So I'm going to speak today on this book, Making and Unmaking Nations, and I really consider this book to be the culmination of my life's work on this topic. The basic question of this book is, why does genocide happen? And I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into that question. But this book itself took about 9 years of my life, traveling back and forth to Africa and just a lot of thinking, and before that, almost a decade of research on genocide. So I thought for this talk I would try to distill some of the core ideas that are, I think, embedded in this book in recognition of the honor. So I think one of the fundamental approaches of this book, and I'll get into why in just a minute, is if we want to understand some of the worst events in the world, some of the most horrible events, we should not only be studying the ones that do occur, which is primarily how this topic has been studying, but we should also be studying the ones that do not occur and had a chance of occurring, and what I call negative cases. So that's one of the core ideas in this book. Excuse me, I skipped ahead here. The second argument, or second core idea in the book, is that we should be trying to understand not only what are the factors that drive escalation, that drive violence forward, but also the things that restrain it, that hold it back. And here I talk about the importance of the sources of de-escalation, the sources of restraint. And the third argument, excuse me, I keep skipping ahead, excuse me, has to do about the importance of ideas and how ideas shape patterns of violence. The dominant approach in political science and in security studies is to think about the origins of violence as primarily strategic, and I think that's right. But I argue in this book that ideas about identity, about community, about the nation shape how leaders make decisions in crises, in particular in military crises, and they're fundamental for understanding why this violence happens. And then lastly, from a policy-making point of view, I argue that genocide is not an inevitable outcome. We think about this type of violence as, people sit around and plan it and then they implement it. But I argue that this is really the product of fluid decision-making and dynamic interactions. And one of the implications of that is if you see this endpoint of genocide is that you can interrupt that process or you can shape that process before it gets to the point of actually being genocide. So those are some of the core ideas that I think are in the book, and I hope you can retain as I go through some of the main elements of the book and questions in the book and empirics in the book. So my story really starts with Rwanda and the genocide in 1994. And I had been a journalist covering the aftermath of the genocide. This was an extraordinary episode of violence in which at least 500,000 civilians were killed in 3 months. And I covered the aftermath as a reporter, and I ultimately went back to graduate school and made this the subject of my dissertation and my initial research. And my first main book was a really detailed story about Rwanda, and in which I spent a lot of time in the prisons interviewing perpetrators who are pictured here. And it was really a kind of micro account of how the violence in Rwanda unfolded. Now this book, there we go, okay, too jumpy, really thinks about Rwanda in a comparative perspective. Okay? And if you look at the violence in Rwanda, it had some very distinct elements to it. It was extraordinarily swift. It was 3 months. It was extraordinarily participatory in the sense that you had hundreds of thousands of civilians. Am I doing something wrong? Okay. So hundreds of thousands of civilians who participated in the violence. But if you look at a slightly more macro perspective, it had some of the structural conditions that are common to other genocides. Number one, it occurred during a civil war. Number two, it was after a period of significant political instability and economic decline. Number three, you had a kind of past unpunished violence or the absence of accountability and a kind of long history of discrimination inside of Rwanda. You also have the presence of kind of nationalism or the sort of, I'll come back to this a little bit later, but the idea that the country should belong to the majority of the Hutu population. And then, of course, very famously in Rwanda, you had these militias and you had hate media that were very, very active in the country. Okay. Now, if you look at the way in which people have been theorizing why genocide occurs, is they look at those conditions and they say, yeah, there are a bunch of other cases that have the same factors in common. And if you look at the main comparisons of other genocides, the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda and Cambodia, people, and we can discuss how Cambodia fits if you're interested, but they basically say, look, all of these cases have those things in common. And that's why genocide occurs. That's the causal structure of genocide. The problem is that if that were true, there should be many more genocides than there are in the world today, or there have been over the last 50 years. That is, the variables that I've just outlined, civil war, discrimination, nationalism, militias, hate media even, are fairly common in the world today. Decline, political instability, but the outcome of genocide, depending on how you define it, is very rare. Okay? And if you think about this in statistical terms, the way that forecasters would label this, and they do in this field, is the problem of false positives, that there are many more predictions that genocide are going to happen than actually occur. Okay? And so the basic conclusion, my starting point, is there's something that we're not understanding here. There's a limitation to our theory in where we are. And so if you look, you see this, I'll just use my hands. Here's a map of, of West Africa, of West Africa and parts of Northwest Africa. And if you were to look at, these various countries, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Niger, Northern Nigeria, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Mauritania, in each of these countries, I could make an argument that exactly the same factors that I just outlined are present, and yet in none of these has genocide occurred, okay, with the exception of Congo, which, if you're interested, we can come back to. And so more specifically, let me just take a deeper dive on Cote d'Ivoire. This is a country that I've studied in depth in recent years. You had an armed conflict. You had a civil war from 2002, more or less, to 2011, with a period in between. You had very significant political instability in the country. You had a coup, you had a counter-coup, another coup, a failed election, and so forth. You have a brand of nationalism called Ivoirité, which is a French word that basically means Cote d'Ivoire is for Ivorians. You've got militias, and this is a picture of a guy named Charles Blé-Goudet, who was the leader of this youth movement, a kind of militia movement inside of Cote d'Ivoire. And just to give you a sense, in French it says, nous sommes prêts à tout, which is like, we're ready for anything, a kind of really militant group, and this is a protest here. Past discrimination, past violence, hate media that people were comparing to Rwanda. Yet, if you look at the patterns of violence, it was bad for Cote d'Ivoire. I'm not saying this is, a great country. I mean, a great circumstance. But there was no genocide or nothing even approaching it. You're talking about an average over this period of about 1,000 civilian deaths per year, which is, again, very bad, but not genocide. Okay? If you look at Mali, similarly, you had a I'll come back to Mali a little bit later, and Cote d'Ivoire. But in the early 1990s, you had a rebellion from a Tuareg group, which is a minority group up in the north. Again, you have a civil war. You had a long period of political instability, the overthrow of a long-standing dictator, just like in Rwanda. You had a kind of nationalism in the country, you have a history of unpunished violence, just like in Rwanda. You've got very significant past discrimination. You've got a militia group that was calling for the extermination of these Tuaregs, both in the 1990s and more recently, if some of you remember when the French intervened. In any case, but in Mali, the outcome was negotiation, accommodation, and the resolution of conflict. Right? So the question that I'm asking in this book is, why does genocide happen sometimes but not other times? Okay? And how do strategies of violence develop? When leaders are looking at broadly similar conditions, why are some of them escalating violence and ultimately pursuing the most extreme form of violence, genocide, and others are pursuing negotiation or lower levels of violence? Okay? Now, the way in which I answer that question, the sort of empirical work of the book, is number one, the kind of backbone of the book are controlled qualitative comparisons. And what I was looking for in selecting cases were ones that had some broad similarities. I'm not comparing Rwanda to Denmark, okay? Or you pick your favorite country in the world. These are countries that had, from a political science methodology, what people call the possibility principle. These are countries that had major crises. They were in armed conflict. They had some very serious crisis that would suggest there was a good chance that they were going to end up in genocide, like Cote d'Ivoire and Mali. And in the end, I chose Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and also Senegal. Those are the negative cases, the ones that could have resulted in genocide but did not. And I compared them to Rwanda and to Sudan, and specifically the crisis in Darfur from 2003 through around 2007. I took trips to these countries. I did a lot of interviews with political elites, with military elites, which are often the most interesting, collected a lot of information, just collect as much information as I could, often from human rights documents or from UN sources or elsewhere. And then eventually I constructed a database of presidential speeches, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, basically from independence to the present in these 5 countries. Now, one of the things that, so now I'm going to kind of back you up. This is probably the slightly more academic portion of the talk. And I'm going to tell you what it is, like how I define my dependent variable. And in this field, the question of like what is genocide is a question that has plagued this field since the beginning. And I argue that genocide and what I'm going to call mass categorical violence, genocide is a form of mass categorical violence, has three properties to it. Number one, it's group selective violence, meaning that this is violence targeted against people of a particular social category, of a particular group. And that's in contrast to the way most people think about this violence, which is as indiscriminate violence. And I argue indiscriminate is not a good adjective for this type of violence. And I argue that this nature of it being highly selective violence requires information. And that information comes from local sources. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, the second property of genocide is that it's sustained, extensive violence, it's large-scale violence, and that's going to require coordination over time and space. This is hard violence to actually carry out. And then lastly, what's distinctive about genocide is this concept of a logic of group destruction. Okay? And so what do I mean by that? Political scientists tend to think about violence as primarily coercive. You use violence in order to shape behavior. You're essentially saying to people, there is a high cost if you continue down your path, and I'm going to use violence to dissuade you from continuing down that path. And it's communicative violence, it's coercive violence. Okay? But I think genocide as a category of event, I think, follows a different logic. It's not shaping future behavior. The fundamental logic is destroying the group, rather than shaping their future behavior. And so I argue that what's distinctive about genocide is this group that is targeted has to be seen as dangerous and unwinnable, meaning you can't persuade them, and as uncontainable. You can't contain them, you can't win them over, and they're a threat. Okay? So the argument here I'm going to sort of break it down into 5 steps. So number one, I've already indicated. Fundamental to my story is that genocide is a process. People don't just wake up one morning and say, let's go commit genocide. It's part of a chain of escalation over time, subject also to the possibility of de-escalation. Right? It can go up, it can get more extreme, or it can go down, or stay the same, or whatever. Okay? The main driver of escalation is threat. It's war. Okay? And if you look at almost any group of perpetrators that talk about, justify why it is they do what they do, they will say, in effect, like, we had to kill them or they were going to kill us. And so the notion that threat drives violence is really fundamental to my story. Now, where does threat come from? Part of threat is material. Right? It's about there's an armed enemy and they are threatening to take over our country. And you can look at the strength, their military strength of that enemy or the demographic strength of that group that's perceived as an enemy. But part of it is also constructed. Part of it is the perception of vulnerability, the sense of threat, which can and cannot be, is both actually materially based but is also partly in people's imagination. But I argue that ultimately the empirical condition that we are going to see genocide to be most likely is war. And if you look empirically, almost every single genocide or any other major episode of mass violence occurs in the context of war. And that's no accident, because in war, threat is elevated. In war, you get the deployment of people with specialization to commit violence. In war, moderates are washed out. I mean, war is really the cauldron in which genocide is forged. But the question then remains, as I suggested earlier, why in some wars but not others are you seeing genocide? I argue that here's where we have to think about ideas and ideology, or what I call founding narratives. And the claim in the book is that these founding narratives shape how elites respond to threat in war. These founding narratives are effectively stories about who the political community is, who the state is for, and what the main political values are in that state. These are narratives that are forged at critical junctures. In the African subset that I'm looking at, that means at independence and also at the period of regime change after the end of the one-party dictatorship period across the continent. And I argue that these narratives shape how people think about their threat and shape how they think about what's an appropriate response to the threat. It allows them to frame the fight as between populations. It's us and them. That whole construct of us and them framed as populations is, I think, an ideological foundation, has an ideological foundation. So the argument so far is that genocide is a process subject to both forces of escalation and de-escalation. There's a kind of interaction here between security and strategic elements, the notion of threat and war, and between ideas and ideology. And the condition that we are most likely to see genocide is when the founding narrative establishes a core us that is threatened in wartime by a them that is defined outside the core political community. Now, there are two further conditions, I think, that also matter. And the first of those two conditions is that it requires capacity, it requires power to be able to execute this kind of violence, right? That again, this is a violence that requires group selection, which means you need to find, sort, and control at some level the target population. You need to stop them from going somewhere. You need to find them, and you need to kill them, or you need to inflict major violence across time. This is sustained violence, and across space. This is violence that's happening across multiple locations in a single country. That requires coordination, typically coordination across multiple agencies of the state, like the army, the police, the civilian administration, the national government. And it also requires, I think, both national level support and local participation. We tend to think in these literatures about sort of disaggregate it between like what are the micro drivers and what are the macro drivers. Well, I argue that you need both to execute this level of violence. And I think that can be accomplished in two ways. One is through a kind of centralized vertical state system, or through a more decentralized set of informal alliances. And then lastly, I also think there's this, and I suggested this earlier, the importance of restraint. That most of the way that people have thought about this violence is what are the things that drive it? And I argue that we also should be thinking about what restrains it or moderates it or leads to de-escalation. And I think that there are a couple ways in which we can think about restraint. One is a counter-narrative to a founding narrative that's more exclusionary. Another is the absence of capacity. Groups don't have the ability to actually exercise this kind of violence. Or it could be other, so those are sort of the inverse of what I've argued, but there are other possible sources of restraint. One of them is economic. That is that were you to execute this level of violence, that it would destroy your economy and therefore your tax base, and that creates an incentive for moderation. Another could be democracy, the ability to essentially have multiple voices weighing in and stronger checks and balances, or possibly external intervention. And these are other possible sources of restraint. So the summary claim here is mass categorical violence and genocide are most likely to occur under a set of very unusual circumstances. There has to be a high threat. That threat has to be defined as a non-core political community and fighting the core population of the state. The perpetrators have to have the organizational capacity to be able to carry out this level of violence, and there has to be weak restraints on escalation. That's true for both mass categorical violence and genocide. What is specific to genocide is that the threatening group is seen as both not only threatening but also unwinnable. You can't persuade them to stop threatening us, and uncontrollable in the sense that we can't just keep them down. Okay? So now let me kind of walk you back then through the cases and show you, I think, how the argument works and then what some of the implications of the argument are. So returning here to Cote d'Ivoire, okay? On the right hand, I've kind of pulled some headlines showing you that there was a real fear that in Cote d'Ivoire, in both 2002 and 2003 and 2004, that there was a strong risk of genocide, and then again in 2010 and 2011 in Cote d'Ivoire. Those are kind of peak periods of danger. Structurally, you had an armed conflict between 2002 and 2007, and that was overlaid onto a broader cleavage in that society, where in the north, where the rebels were based, was primarily Muslim, and in the south, which was controlled by the government, was primarily Christian. And the Southerners and the Southern leaders framed their fight as one about who was a true Ivorian, right? A classic nationalist move, which is why people were concerned about genocide. Cote d'Ivoire is the #1 cocoa producer in the world, 3rd largest coffee producer in the world, very competent civil service and more or less army, and have the ability to carry out this violence if the leaders wanted to. So the risks were there. The risk factors are there. But I argue that there are a set of ideas, and I'm sorry for the small type, but a set of ideas in that society, and in particular among the political elite, that strongly ran counter to genocide. And I argue that this is a founding narrative in the country, which is that Cote d'Ivoire is a multi-ethnic state, a multi-religious state. Okay? And this counter-narrative really served as a counterweight to the nationalists. And I think encouraged them to look for other ways of framing the conflict and look ultimately for other solutions. And I argue that the legacy, this counter-narrative of multi-ethnicity can be traced to Cote d'Ivoire's founding father, to a guy named Félix Houphouët-Boigny. And I went back and read all of his speeches. And he emphasized again and again and again, he kind of made the nation on the values of dialogue, of tolerance, of unity, of peace. If you looked at his practice, what he did is he would take people of one ethnic group, bring them into the civil service, and then send them to another part of the country where they would govern over populations with different ethnicity, different religion, and so forth. If you looked at his cabinets, he was a master of practicing ethnic balancing, meaning that he would make sure that there was ethnic representation within his cabinets. And the bottom line is, in Cote d'Ivoire, the idea that Cote d'Ivoire is in fact a Christian state or a Southern state or belongs to one community, I don't think exists. I know some people wanted to make it that way, but they encountered a whole a phalanx of opposition to that idea embedded in the society and embedded in the elites in that society. I'm not saying this guy was an angel, but I think that this was a strong counterweight to the risk of genocide. And then if you speak to people, when I would do interviews with military leaders or political leaders, even people who were the kind of more extreme nationalists in the country, they would say, nous sommes brassés, which means like we're all mixed together. Like my first cousin, my wife, my husband, my this, my that. Like we come from this part and that part, and they would do all these gestures and like I'm doing, and basically to indicate that this country is fundamentally intermixed, as fundamental to that society. And I think in Cote d'Ivoire there's a second level of restraint in the society, which I think is primarily about the economy. So Cote d'Ivoire is this vast agricultural exporting giant, right? This is a picture that I took, where there's just products that are coming from the upcountry being, basically being processed and being exported, primarily cocoa and coffee, but many other products as well. That agriculture, you need stability to make that agricultural economy work, number one. Number two, the people that are doing a lot of that work and that control those farms are in fact the migrants that would have been targeted in any genocide. And so I think this created a kind of economic incentive not to escalate violence inside of Cote d'Ivoire. There's also a story here about international intervention, which I'm happy to come back to, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll just skip for now. But I think those are the other two factors. Coming back to Mali, again, you had a strong risk of genocide. Again, I've pulled some quotes. This one is in French, and this one is basically quoting from the early 1990s, an academic article that was saying, you know, these militia groups, which I'll come to in a second, were openly proclaiming the extermination of the Tuareg groups in the north. And here, this is from 2011, where we have now a UN genocide advisor who's warning that of a risk to genocide of the Arab and Tuareg populations of the north. Okay? So again, here you have an armed conflict in the 1990s. It's being driven by these northern groups, which are seen as a racially different group from those who controlled the state. You had that in both in the 1990s, and you had that in the 2010s. Okay? The threat in the north was, I think, on the weaker side in the 90s, but it was quite strong in the 2010s. Okay? Now, the state is not very strong in Mali. It's a huge country. But you had the possibility of these kind of decentralized alliances between these militia groups that were openly calling for extermination and the national army and the national state. Okay? But what happened? Oops, sorry. Ultimately, the outcome in Mali, as I suggested before, was negotiation, accommodation, peace agreements, rather than the state funding those militias, encouraging those militias, helping those militias, as they did in Rwanda and Sudan. The army came in and disarmed the militias and said, what you're doing is not constitutional. We are in charge of protecting the security of the state. So why? And I argue here again that there is a founding narrative that I trace principally to a group of Democrats in the early 1990s. Here is pictured a guy named Alpha Umar Konaré, Malian president in the 1990s. And again, went back and looked at his speech. All he would talk about is dialogue. This, you know, in one of his first major speeches, which he repeated again and again, he said, dialogue is the master word of my policy. And then he grounded that on a vision of Mali based on mediation, based on orality and negotiation. And they said this goes back to our Malian tradition from the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries when we were once great, and what made us great was big tent politics and dialogue. And I argue that that basically shaped the response to the military crisis that they had in Mali. And again, that also resonated with the everyday experiences of many Malians, which is famous for this kind of informal conflict resolution, a practice that they call cousinage in Mali. Now, contrast that to Rwanda. Okay? You know, using my framework, you have an armed conflict. So you have a similar armed conflict. Here you've got Tutsis, which are an ethnic minority in the country, who invade and start a war in 1990 from the north, from Uganda. And ultimately, this is a very high threat. These rebels turn out to be stronger militarily than a kind of divided government inside of Rwanda. Now, in contrast to the other two cases that I just talked about, the founding narrative in Rwanda is fundamentally about how Rwanda is a Hutu state. And the grounding ideology is this notion of a social revolution, a Hutu social revolution from the late 1950s and early 1960s, which essentially holds the Hutus are the majority. If you're talking about democracy, democracy means majority rule means Hutu rule. The Tutsis have oppressed us for centuries, and this is the founding ideology. This is the founding narrative of Rwanda, emphasized both by the first president of Rwanda, Gregoire Kayibanda, and the second president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana. Okay? Rwanda has a very strong state, very capable state. It's a poor country, but an extremely extensive local administration. Here's an example, and I know you probably can't read this, and I'm sorry for the small type, but this was sort of one of those moments in my research when it was like an aha moment. This was a document that was distributed on April 12th, 1994, which is seen as the real turning point in the genocide. And essentially, it was a call to arms. Okay? But if you look at the language of the call to arms, it was all Rwandans, protect the republic and democracy which you achieved with the 1959 popular revolution. That's the founding narrative. Our country is about, its freedom is about the revolution. The Inkotanyi, which is a synonym for the rebels, want to erase your achievements and return you to servitude. Threat. Blah, blah, blah. Everyone keep going. There is a great danger at its gates. You are under attack. Threat. Okay? But furthermore, put aside, this is the call to arms, put aside your divisions, Rwanda, this says. Unite your forces so that you can face the grandchildren of UNR that have decided to submit you once again to servitude. This is the logic of genocide. UNR was the political party at independence, framing the rebels as the grandchildren of the party at independence that wanted to go against the revolution is basically saying, these guys will never change. They are a threat. They are unwinnable, and the response, I think that's what gives rise to the logic of genocide. Now, the restraint, so the flip side is, was there anything to work against that? And my argument is no, or very little. On the ideological side, you did not have a strong counter-narrative to the Hutu revolution as the grounding ideology of the state, right? Both the opposition party, the Hutu-dominated opposition parties, and the ruling party in the country, both basically argued the revolution is our foundation. They had differences between them, but that part was consistent. If you look at the economic side, there was export agriculture, but it was a very small part of the overall economy and did not employ Tutsis as key labor supply. And if you look at the international intervention, kind of famously, this is a picture of Romeo Dallaire, who was the UN force commander who tried to stop the genocide, or wanted to stop the genocide. They were famously ill-prepared, ill-equipped, ill-mandated, etc., to do anything, and they withdrew. Let me kind of wrap up now and talk about what are some of the implications here for research and also for policy. And then I would love to take your questions. So what does this book do? What do I hope it does? Number one, I think it develops a theory of genocide. Right? That was what I set out for myself. Right? That is what has motivated me for the last 20 years. Why does genocide happen? And I think, of course there's going to be much future research, but what I think the book is trying to do is to say, here's an argument for why it happens and why it's rare. These are an unusual set of a combination of factors. Furthermore, it kind of builds a linkage, an analytic linkage to other forms of violence. It's sort of seeing genocide as a particular kind of violence, but showing and arguing why this type of violence occurs versus other types of violence, and I think trying to build an analytic field of studies of violence. It brings ideology back into the story. Political scientists and many scholars of civil war, of political violence, etc., don't really think about ideology as fundamental, and I argue it is fundamental. And then the importance of leadership and agency, and in particular this sort of first generation of African leaders, or this sort of Democrats as the country's democratized in the early 90s. I think they made key decisions. They were kind of, history gave them a set of choices, a set of terms, but they made choices about who their country was for and what it was about that I think had long-term consequences for how the sort of elite political culture in these countries and how those elites responded in crises. On the method side, as I argued earlier, it emphasizes the importance of negative cases and the importance of thinking about comparable cases. I try to develop a new conceptual framework for thinking about genocide. And then there's a specific set of arguments about Africa, right? We tend to think about Africa as a continent, of death and disaster and bad leadership and et cetera and corruption. One of the things that I'm arguing is there's actually a ton of variation in Africa, right? You've got your Rwandans and your Sudans and your South Sudans today and your Nigerias in the 1960s and what have you, but there are a lot of places where you have stability, or there are a lot of places where leaders decide not to pursue the worst of the worst. And in addition, that there are legacies of leadership on the continent that ultimately, were about creating national communities out of very diverse and plural populations. And that those efforts actually bear long-term fruit in these countries. On the policy side, I think there's a kind of argument here that really the drivers and the restraints in this type of violence are really domestic. Like, we need to be humble and understand what the limitations of what outsiders can do in these kinds of circumstances. But nonetheless, I think that there are, a set of implications on the policy side that I hope can be brought out from this book. So number one is just, the values of pluralism are really important to stress. And multi-ethnicity, the values of multi-ethnicity, the values of pluralism. I think this, if you accept the argument that threat is the main driver of violence, what international actors should be thinking about as an utmost priority is how do you diminish perceptions of threat? And probably one of the best ways to do that is through peacekeeping and designing peacekeeping in such a way that it is either separating forces or finding ways to share information to diminish the perceptions of threat. Going further down the line, if you want to think about actually trying to stop a genocide or the early onset of a genocide as it's happening, if you accept my argument about how this violence transpires, thinking about measures that actually interrupt these coalitions of violence, this multi-agency coordination that makes this violence possible. I think that elite perpetrators in my research are sensitive to cost. They're making strategic calculations about what is the best move that's in their interests. And I think that can be countered by thinking about imposing costs on those elite perpetrators. And then lastly, just a fundamental principle is violence is not inevitable. It follows a chain of escalation, or it could follow a chain of de-escalation, and that creates a space for maneuver for trying to think about shaping that process. And then lastly, the appendix of the book is a diagnostic tool designed for policymakers that allows them to look at a situation qualitatively and say, what are the risk factors? What are the chances that this violence is going to escalate to genocide? And then, in addition, has a diagnostic tool for thinking about, can we see that genocide is happening or not? And I think those are some of the policy implications. Oops. Sorry, keep doing that. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Now that you've seen the presentation, I hope you won't take the award away. Right? Yeah.
Let's get some questions. Okay, I'll let you choose if you want. I will.
Sounds good.
Let's start on this side.
There's a gentleman right here in the front.
I would like to ask, like in Rwanda with the Tutsi and the Hutus, do you think colonization by them taking in and making the Hutus less important and letting the Tutsi be, the elite class was the purpose of that genocide at that time?
Yeah, so I think, thanks for the question. So I think that the history of colonialism is really important for thinking about how the founding narrative emerged in Rwanda. So the founding narrative in Rwanda that I was arguing for is saying, the Hutu are the majority, they've been oppressed by Tutsis, freedom and independence. This is a movement that emerged in the late colonial period. It meant just not freedom from the Belgians, but it meant freedom from the Tutsis. Now, why did they think like that? One of the reasons they thought that way is precisely because of the colonial administration, which, as you were suggesting, widened differences between Hutus and Tutsis, developed a whole racial ideology of how Tutsis were this superior class of people that came from the north and were born to rule, all this nonsense, and then measured their noses and their skin colors and their heights, all this stuff, right? That then, that was the justification for why this Tutsi minority should rule under colonialism. But at the independence period, that got flipped around, and the Hutu elite said, actually, no, what majority, what independence and freedom and democracy mean are majority rule. We are the indigenous majority of this country. Therefore, freedom means we rule. And that was built precisely on the building blocks of the colonial rule and the colonial ideas that were introduced from the late 19th century up until independence in the early 1960s. So the colonialism is very much a part of the story here. I don't think sometimes in Rwanda people will say now, like, the genocide started in 1959, or it all goes back to the Belgians and the Germans before them. I think that's an exaggeration, but they are fundamentally, their intervention are fundamentally a part of the story of how this took place.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Next question.
Chuck, you decide who to bring it to. You decide. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
From what I understand of Britain's colonial policy, was to divide tribal regions into two different countries and to also combine traditionally hostile tribes together, and this way this whole divide and conquer, divide and rule policy took an effect. In order to correct this problem, might not be a good idea to allow secession and other types of ways of people devising their own homelands, merging here, dividing there. To me, limiting government and decentralization is the path not just for Africa, but for countries all over the world.
Well, it's hard to rewrite the history of how these countries, exist, right? We're not going to have a world in which we're going to go from 54 countries in Africa to 1,000 countries in Africa. I think that's highly unlikely. What I'm suggesting is an alternative to what you're suggesting, which is, the independence leaders in Africa faced precisely this challenge. They were bequeathed countries that were multi-ethnic, multi-religious, that had not been countries for very long, that had, in many cases, had colonialism for 2 or 3 generations, and where the levels of education were very low. In many countries you had 20, 50 people who had been to university. And the question is, how do we make a country? How do we make a country? And I'm arguing that in places like Cote d'Ivoire, for all of the problems of Houphouet's leadership, one of his main agendas was, I need to build a national political community. And I think those efforts ultimately were the intellectual reserve that stopped genocide in that country. So I think what I'm suggesting is there are ways of trying to build bridges across groups that essentially are peace and tolerating, supportive.
Yeah, let's stay over here. One more question, and then go back to that side.
Hello, my name is Anna Cecile Pepper. I'm a senior here. Thank you so much for speaking up with us today. So your research seems mostly to focus on Africa. Can you talk about how some of the factors you identified or the processes you described might be applied to, like, maybe the Armenian Genocide, or perhaps what's going on in Syria right now? Thank you.
Okay, so the Armenian Genocide for sure. When I'm in the book, when I'm trying to build the theory, I draw on non-African cases to build the theory, including the Holocaust, including the Armenian Genocide, and other cases. So the Armenian Genocide, I think the framework is basically is very similar. So you have threat, it's World War I. The violence is going to be essentially escalating as the Ottomans go to war against Russia, and they lose, and then they blame the Armenians for their loss. If you look at the founding narrative inside of the Ottoman Empire, the late Ottoman Empire in particular, it's all about the Young Turk movement. It's all about the CUP, the Committee on Union and Progress. They've got a vision of pan-Turkic nationalism that I think shapes how they respond to this perception of threat from the Armenian community. If you look at the way in which the violence was carried out, you had both a very strong central state and the various ministries, I can't recall off the top of my head, that were involved ultimately in the mass deportation order, but they were working in combination with these local actors, many of whom were Kurds, in Anatolia, and producing that coalition of national and local actors that were basically massacring and forcing Armenians out. And if you look at the restraint, I just don't see it in that. So I think this sort of notion of war, threat, plus a founding narrative that defines a core political community that's threatened in war, that's, I think, was pretty fundamental to that story. Now, the Syria case is a little bit different, okay? And I haven't studied, I don't know enough about Syria, but I'll just give you my, my basic response, but under the caveat of I haven't studied it because it's relatively recent. But number one, there's no question it's occurring in civil war, right? And the violence, if you look at the patterns of violence in Syria, there's a dramatic escalation as you see the protest movement shift from a nonviolent stage to a violent stage, right? That's when the army gets more involved and starts to take a much more aggressive line against the civilians in Syria, and particularly eastern Syria. But now, what's the narrative? What's the founding narrative? There is a formal narrative, but I think what's really undergirding the response is the sense that this is a minority, the Alawites, that are under threat from the majority. They have a strong sense of vulnerability, and that what the state is that what stands in the way from genocide. Like that's, from their point of view, they're facing a Sunni majority, and they need to, and that's the threat, and that what they stand for is the protection of minority interests. And I think that's why they have this core of Alawite support inside of Syria. And so that narrative, I think, is shaping the military response to the threat, and I think is ultimately justifying some of the violence against the civilians on this large scale. In terms of the capacity, again, I mean, I think there it gets more complicated, and where my details and knowledge of the Syria case, I think, are a little not, I need to study it. But my sense is that the military capacity both comes from the actual Syrian army, but in combination with Iranian forces, in combination with Russian forces. And so how that coalition of violence is taking place, I think, is that I haven't studied and I can't speak to. It's an oil economy, right? Or it's an economy with, I think there's oil in Syria. No. I'm thinking about Libya, I'm sorry. But in terms of the economic restraints, I don't see it necessarily in Syria. And again, I don't know the case as well, as I may have just indicated, so, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Strauss, for your presentation. Yeah. My name is Patrick Litang. I work for Kentucky Refugee Ministries.
Okay.
My question has to do with the legal and the international implications of what we call genocide. Because in some contexts, such as in Burundi, some would argue that genocide occurred, but it was a slow burn genocide. In a matter of 10 years, over 300,000 people died. Another one that people will consider genocide is the case of DRC,
yep,
where Paul Kagame army got to the Congo and basically killed tons of Hutu populations.
Absolutely.
Now, the other question that I do have is, how does that idea of the international community defining and determining what is genocide affect all these presentation and all the work that you've done?
Okay, so let me take that in a couple stages. So let me just clarify what the international definition is, talk about what I'm doing that's different, and then talk specifically about Burundi and Congo. So the international definition, the legal definition, is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group. Okay? And that's a legal definition, which I think is fundamentally the idea there is intentional group destruction. But there are a couple limitations with that legal definition from the point of social science scholarship and the point of view of policy making. Number one, it focuses on the concept of intent to destroy. And what that means in practice is you have to find that intent. And it's very difficult to find that intent in real time and sometimes afterwards. And so the notion that a policy tool would be based on this ability to prove intent has proven to be a real limitation in the way in which that legal framing operates. The second limitation of it is that it's ethnic, racial, religious, and national groups. That leaves out a bunch of groups that theoretically could be subject to violence, could be regional groups, could be political groups, could be gender groups, whatever, right? And so scholars like me and others have said if we want to use this as a social scientific concept that defines a category of events and that is also useful from a policy-making point of view, we need to move away from the UN legal definition to a broader concept that helps us understand this class of events. So I'm arguing it's group selective violence. So in contrast to the UN definition, I'm not saying it's a particular kind of group. It's group-oriented violence, but it's not those four groups, right? It's large-scale violence, meaning it's sustained over time, it's massive violence. That's also not inherent to the UN definition. And then finally, it's this, the sort of logic of it is group destruction. So I'm creating a different way of thinking about genocide that's rooted in the International Convention, but I think is a more specific definition that's usable for both social science and for policy. Congo. In the book, I argue it's genocide, right? You look, you know, the RPF, I'm sorry for people who are not familiar with it, but very quickly, you know, in 96 and 97, the RPF, they went into Congo, they separated out the refugees, they brought back around, you know, 2/3 of them or whatever, 3/5 of them into the country, they pushed the other ones west, and when they got pushed west, they went on search and destroy missions, and they killed more than 100,000, probably 200,000 refugees. They were not all armed actors. Most of them, 90, whatever the percentage were refugees. They were not armed. And that was group selective violence. They were looking for Hutus. It was mass violence. It was sustained on a large scale. It was against civilians. And then the question is, does it conform to a logic of genocide, to group destruction? And I would argue that they wanted to destroy that group. All Hutus remained in Congo. Their main orientation was to destroy them. Now, that's a controversial position, but I think it's a defensible provision. Burundi, I would not, the sort of period, I don't know if you were talking about the period from 96 to like 2006 or 2007. That period, I think there were pockets of massacres, but I wouldn't say that there was, you know, this logic of group destruction. You know, there was violence, but I wouldn't say there was this, like, some sustained campaign of group destruction. But in 1972, definitely, right? In 1972, you have a period in which, in response to a insurgency, so a threat, you get the Tutsi-led army that it goes in and they destroy, on a large scale, Hutu with education. And so in that sense, I think Burundi in 72, I think you can call it a genocide or mass categorical violence, however you want to frame it. But the later period, I think, is a little bit more ambiguous. Yeah.
Question over here.
Could you make the argument that a country in Asia like Afghanistan, specifically known issues like Taliban and stuff like that, and group of massive disasters, could you be like a reason why armed conflicts, as specific to Taliban, can lead up to possibly a huge genocide in that area?
In Afghanistan?
Yes.
God, I don't know enough about Afghanistan. I mean, I don't think the Taliban kind of control enough territory and have enough of the kind of power to be able to exercise this level of violence over time and space. There's clearly a civil war. So let me just kind of take your, because I don't know enough about Afghanistan to answer your questions. I don't see it right now, but it's possible. I don't see it right now. But there's a whole broader question of, like, can non-state actors commit this kind of violence? And if you were to use the framework that I developed,
Specifically, like the kind of narrative, like using how the Taliban can be like a group of armed conflict and, you know, lead up to that.
yeah, so it's an armed conflict. They just, I don't think they control enough territory or populations to be able to exercise this level of violence, right? They have probably the narrative. They have a narrative of a particular vision of Sharia law and of, particular vision of Islam that I think is fairly exclusionary. They're clearly under threat. I just don't think they have the power. I don't think they have the ability to carry out this kind of violence in the context of contemporary Afghanistan. Now, ISIS, though, is a different story. Contemporary ISIS does not, but in the areas that ISIS controlled between Iraq and Syria, and in particular over the Yazidi population, I think most experts, including myself, would argue, and also UN experts and the Holocaust Museum argue that that was genocide against the Yazidi. It's very difficult for non-state actors to command the command of power and territorial domination to be able to carry out this level of violence, but ISIS did control that space for a period of time. I don't think the Taliban control it in the same way today. Yeah.
Okay. One more over here, and then we'll go to the other side.
Yes. The topic today is about genocide and whatever, and what come to my mind is the Holocaust and Adolf Hitler. Could you kind of speak on that a little bit? Is it relevant?
It's definitely relevant. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the Holocaust was is a specific version of the same kind of event in the sense that it occurred over multiple countries. So one of the distinctive elements of the Holocaust is that this genocide was not just in Germany, right? It was also in 15 other countries across Europe, and so that adds another dimension. Okay, using the argument that I developed here, there was a war. It was World War II. You had, if you look at the periods of escalation within that war, that is, you move from a period of persecution of Jews and discrimination against Jews to a period of destruction of Jews. That period of escalation correlates to the deepening of the war that Germany found itself into, and in particular, it getting bogged down in the Soviet Union, and then ultimately the entry of the United States into the war. So they go from a kind of full-scale control of World War II to a much more tenuous military scene. And I think that perception of threat, in particular from the Soviet Union, escalated, drove the violence to a more extreme level. If you look at the founding narrative, right, it's Nazism. That's about a core national community. That's about the Aryan race and this other group, the Jews and other non-Aryan groups that were seen to be not part of that core national community, who were allied with their threats in World War II, the Soviet Union. If you look at power and the capability of that operation, both in terms of its military capacity, its militias, and then the alliances it formed with local actors in whether it's Romania or Poland or wherever, you're seeing this forging of these sort of national and local coalitions of violence. And in terms of restraint, I think that that Germany was able to ramp up its war economy to the extent at which the economic interests were around war, and so I think the framework is maybe a little more controversial for the Holocaust, but in my view, the basic insights of it apply to that case as well. And no question, it's a genocide, obviously. Yeah.
My name is Bamba, and I was wondering what is the place of foreign intervention in your theory of genocide? Because in some of the cases you gave, Rwanda, Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali, you always see foreign intervention. In Rwanda, France has been accused of fueling the genocide. Even the United States have been accused of remaining silent when they knew that a genocide was imminent. And in Ivory Coast also, we have the Force Likon that intervened to oust Gbagbo. So how can foreign intervention determine the possibility of a genocide happening or not happening?
So I principally see military intervention. Theoretically, it comes in around the question of restraint, right? If you have a military intervention, it can restrain the actors from executing violence. So in Cote d'Ivoire, what happened is you initially got Licorne by France, and then you got the UN. They created a buffer zone. They separated out the northern rebels from the southern side. And I think that buffer zone essentially created a kind of restraint against the escalation of violence in Cote d'Ivoire. Now, that said, I think the dynamics of violence in Cote d'Ivoire were not, I don't think they ever were going to be genocide for the reasons that I specified. Okay? Now, in Rwanda, you had a UN intervention that was not prepared, and so essentially that did not create a restraint. The violence starts in April of 1994. The international force essentially gets whittled down to 250 soldiers, and they're told you can't intervene. And that, of course, did not act as a restraint on the escalation of violence. In Mali, you're right, in 2011, it mattered. But in the earlier period, in the 1990s, there was no international intervention there. So I think the domestic politics of Mali essentially mitigated against genocide. Senegal, which I didn't talk about here, again, you also don't have an international intervention in Casamance, right? But again, you have, I think that's the domestic politics of Senegal that are mitigating against the violence there. So to answer your question, I think international actors can have an influence. I think this is primarily a domestic story, but international actors can have an influence. The way in which they can have an influence militarily is by acting as a restraint or buffer between these groups that are at war with each other. Yeah.
Okay, let me work my way. Okay, we've got quite a few. So.
Okay, great.
My question is chiefly about the policy implications of your framework. From your research, have you identified any particularly effective channels for international actors to encourage a counter-narrative of pluralism when an internally generated counter-narrative isn't present?
No. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I do think we have to be a little humble. I mean, I think international actors can, maybe not do exactly what you just described, but there can be forms of cooperation. That could be military-to-military cooperation. That could be political training. That can be, basically ways of modeling or incentivizing, the laws of war, forms of pluralism, and so forth. But I don't have a magic bullet there. I just don't. I think it's really about the domestic politics of these countries. I think you can reward it, you can foster it, you can maybe have forms of interstate cooperation that foster these values, but I think it's very difficult to say, this should be your ideology. I think what international actors can do is that they can, on the economic side, they can think about encouraging the diversification of economies so that they have a foundation that is essentially rewards stability and rewards peace, as opposed to being insensitive to peace, right? If you have an oil economy and you massacre your minority population or you massacre 1 million people, those wells keep going. They don't depend upon large numbers of workers. An agricultural economy like in Cote d'Ivoire, if you were to have committed genocide against the northerners, when they started to get displaced, the tax receipts started drying up, the economy started going south. I think that created an incentive to say, look, this is not the right path for this country. But again, diversifying economies, very difficult to do. You have to be humble about that. So I don't have any magic bullets besides what I talked about, which is, I think military interventions, it should be about diminishing threat. I think you can reinforce pluralism in some way or another, in ways maybe I can't imagine. I think you can impose costs on perpetrators. I think that they're sensitive to those costs. But it's hard. It's hard to stop genocide.
We have a question here.
Thank you, Dr. Strauss, for your fruitful presentation. I was really impressed about your research, particularly on genocide in Rwanda. However, I have one question. Many people, whether they are politicians or geopolitics experts, affirm that one of the important triggers of the genocide was the gunning down of the presidential aircraft that was carrying 2 presidents of 2 neighboring countries, such as Burundi and Rwanda. I might be mistaken, but I didn't see any word about the gunning down of the plane. Do you think it's not really important for the genocide, or?
So no, I think it's really important. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Rwanda case, so in 1994, the trigger for the violence was the shooting down of the president with President Habyarimana on the plane on the night of April 6, 1994. And so the way I think about that is that just, elevated the threat in a really serious way, right? Essentially, not only was it the president on the plane, but the Minister of Defense, the head of the presidential guard, you knocked out with that missile strike, you knocked out the head of the military structure of the Rwandan state. That's a whole nother level of warfare. And that was, I think, you can't understand the response that the elites took without understanding the depth of threat perception that followed from the assassination of the president and his top military brass. But my argument is it's not only that threat perception in war, but that gets filtered through the narrative of the state, which is about the Tutsis have no right to control this government. And that's what shaped the dynamics of genocide in Rwanda. But the assassination of the president was fundamental. And controversially, I argue in the book that it was the RPF that did it.
Hi, I'm Danielle Graves. I'm a student here at the University of Louisville. My question's about your research methodology. So you mentioned that you had conducted some interviews with some of the perpetrators of some of these genocides. Did you find it difficult to get them to discuss the events? And if so, how were you able to sort of move past that initial difficulty?
So, not so much for this book, but my previous research, I spent 6 months in the Rwandan prisons interviewing people who had confessed and people whose trials were finished. I kind of went in and I kind of bumbled through my first kind of pilot interviews where I sort of did some initial rounds of interviews, and I was so freaked out by the idea. I mean, I was quite naive. I was so freaked out by the idea. I'm sitting next to someone who killed somebody else. Like, what am I going to do? And so I was like, so why did you do it? And that shut down the interview completely, right? It was a useless strategy. But over time, and working with Rwandan colleagues, I figured out how to design a questionnaire and approach this topic in a way that I think ultimately elicited very valuable responses. And so I designed a questionnaire that was, half of it was basic information that allowed me to test hypotheses about what drove individuals to participate in the violence, their age, their education level, their income, their profession, and stuff like that. And then a long set of questions about how the violence started in their community, and then how they came to be involved in the violence. I would say 4 out of 5, maybe 5 out of 6, people were very willing to speak about it. And I think many qualitative researchers find that you go in and you take the time to interview people about things that were really important in their lives, they often will tell you a lot. Now, it has to be filtered back through the fact that they committed crimes. And you have to understand that they have an inherent bias towards presenting themselves in the best possible light. And I think you have to, when careful in the interpretation of what they say, in terms of remembering that they want to present themselves in the best possible way they can. So the answer to your question is that it was not hard at that time to get access to them, and most wanted to speak. And then I had to learn as a researcher how to design questions that would elicit information in a non-defensive way. And it was extremely, it was very depressing, obviously, but extremely interesting and valuable, and it's fundamental to how I see genocide, right?
Okay, we'll try to get to as many of these as we can.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was curious if in your opinion, if there's any policy implementation that could prevent genocide as a whole, or do you think it's case-to-case specific how to stop it in that region or in that country?
So I think it's both. I think you need a policy framework, right? You need to have a commitment. You need to have the political will and the framework to be, that this is a policy priority and that there is a precedent and rationale for responding. And I think if you look at where we are today in the world, and this would be I'm going to speak to the Louisville Committee on Foreign Relations, or tomorrow, and I'm going to make this argument. I think if you look at where you are today on this question of atrocity prevention, genocide and atrocity prevention, we're in a really different space than we were in the 1990s. There's a stronger policy framework for the United States. There's a stronger policy framework within the United Nations. You look at reforms to peacekeeping. You look at the broad array of tools ranging from criminal prosecution down to targeted sanctions, that the kind of range of tools is much greater. The framework is greater. Some of the legal issues have been thought through in any case, maybe not resolved. Now, you still need political will, meaning you still need to say, you still need to have politicians who say, I care about this issue, and my constituents care about this issue, therefore I'm going to put, political capital, potentially, people's lives at risk in order to respond to it. But you need a framework in which to make those decisions. And I think that framework is much stronger. But to your point, every case is going to be specific, right? If you look at like Syria today, and you compare that to like Burundi, or you compare that to Central African Republic, these are completely different response environments. In Syria, you've got a lot of very complicated dynamics. You've got Russia, you've got Iran, you've got Turkey, you've got Israel, you've got the anti-nuclear agreement, that's a lot of geopolitics that are at stake in the Syrian civil war, right? If you look at Central African Republic or Burundi, those are very different geopolitical environments, which is going to shape the response framework, shape what you can do in those circumstances. So there's the geopolitical environment. There's also the practical environment of like what it is you're trying, how could you mount an operation if you wanted to mount an operation? And those logistical challenges are also going to vary across cases. So I think the answer to your question is it's both. It's both a generic policy and case-specific work. Mm-hmm.
Congratulations on a well-deserved honor. This is wonderful. I have a question about your switch from journalism to the professorship and becoming an author. In terms of your potential sphere of influence, what would you say is the difference between journalism and being an academic?
So it's a good question. I mean, these are all good questions. I don't mean. What I meant to say is I'm stalling and trying to think about my response. Yeah, okay. When I first went to graduate school, I was sort of, I remember I'd gone from like interviewing presidents and being on the front page of newspapers to like sitting out, for office hours, and I was like, what am I thinking? Like this is, But I think there's a pretty fundamental difference between them. I mean, I think as a reporter, you're reporting, you're interviewing experts, you're making observations, you're describing it. I think you can frame things in particular ways that make what you're describing, lead readers to certain conclusions. So I mean, I think journalism, there are people that do that with more care and less care. I think as a scholar, you're really developing the fundamental building blocks for understanding and interpreting these events. Right? You're producing the knowledge base that shapes journalists, how journalists think, how policymakers think. They shape the fundamental, intellectual frameworks by which we interpret and understand the world around us. And that's a really different kind of influence. That's influence that's not the next day and then is forgotten. That's really much more about decades of work. And I can see from the time I started working on genocide 20 years ago to where we are today, the way in which people understand it is much different. It's much more sophisticated. I'm not saying that's my influence, but the influence of the group of us that work on this, contributing to knowledge about how to understand these events, I think, shapes the sort of baseline, the foundations for understanding, and I think that's a very different kind of influence. Plus teaching, which is a different element. I mean, you're through the classroom, and I love to teach, and I love my students at Wisconsin. You can have, I think, you can give people lifelong skills for understanding the world, and for how to think about problems that I think is a different kind of influence than journalists have. So, yeah.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. I have a concentration of my students over here, so
okay.
bear with us. And I want them to have a chance to ask their questions, but I want them to do it quickly in one short sentence. I think there are 4 of them here. So if we could take them all 4
Sure.
as a group, and then we should be able to finish off.
Thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting. I was just wondering, particularly on the topic of pluralism, what are some of the unique challenges in a post-colonial or highly sectarian context of implementing policies which are simultaneously truly egalitarian, yet also redress particular historical grievances without veering towards appearing to be favoritism or something?
Yeah.
Next question, just go ahead.
You cited Cambodia?
Yeah. Sorry, do I study Cambodia?
You cited Cambodia.
Yeah, you want to hear more about it?
So I think that's
okay. Okay, yeah, okay.
With, that's true. With your expanded definition of genocide, should we look at the actions of totalitarian communists in the 20th century as genocidal actions? Yes or no, and why?
Okay.
Teresa.
Can you guys ask some easier questions for me, please? Yeah, okay.
I thought it was really interesting that you chose to study like the African leaders and how they influenced the future generations. Can you talk about how you decided to study those and those speeches, like if something influenced you to do that?
Sure, okay. So I'll take them, I may have to come back to you to remind me of the question, but I'll try to remember, keep them in my head. So the question on pluralism, how do you redress past inequalities without reinforcing, creating new ones, essentially? I think that's a really good question. I think that, which means I don't have a good answer. I think that any type of exclusion, the implication of my work is that forms of exclusion ultimately breed both resentment and can lead to conflict in the first place. And I think that way of conceptualizing who has control of resources, I think ultimately leads to this kind of group-targeted violence. So I think that the answer to your question is, I think that a bad way to approach that is to say, well, this group benefited in the past, therefore they get nothing now. I think the notion of representation across across the major groups in a society is really fundamental. So I don't really have a better answer than to say, like, I think exclusion is ultimately going to be counterproductive, and we need to be thinking about forms of plural representation. That doesn't get the question of how do you redress inequality. I need to think about that. I haven't studied that issue, and I don't feel like I can make that up on the fly. Cambodia, I'm not sure what you want to think about, but I think I think the framework that I developed applies to Cambodia, with the exception there was only a war in the later stages of the rule of Khmer Rouge, right? So you only get the Vietnamese coming in, in 77, 78. But with Cambodia, I think you had, this is where this sort of perception of being at war was really fundamental to the way that those leaders were thinking. And even if you look at some of the decisions that have come out of the ECCC, out of the court for Cambodia, and they basically describe how the leaders imagined that they were in a war, and they were fighting a war, and there were enemies all around them, and I think that was pretty fundamental. I think if you look at their founding narrative, I think then the rest you can spin out. But the question of like, where did the perception of threat come from? It was really present for them. And I don't have a great answer except to say, like, that just seems to be part of the way in which they came out of their civil war, which is they came out of this mindset of, we are fighting imperialism, we're fighting the Vietnamese, we're fighting the monarchy, we're fighting the Lon Nol regime, and they carried that into their rule starting in April of 1975. So I think the perception of threat is there, but like where it comes from is a little bit more bizarre in the Cambodian case. But I think the basic arguments still work for that case, which is a good transition to the communist mass killings, the communist cases. So there are clearly mass categorical violence, most of them. You look at China, you look at Cambodia, you look at, I don't know what else you would be thinking about, Ethiopia. Stalin, thank you. Yeah, duh. I knew I was forgetting one, yeah. You know, clearly you're talking about sustained, large-scale mass violence against civilians targeted against particular groups. The question is whether or not their genocide is going to turn on whether or not there was the attempt to destroy those groups. And I think you can make that for Cambodia with the case of minorities, like the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Cham, and the Buddhist leaders. The Soviet Union I don't know well enough to be able to say maybe the kulaks, you know, the sort of middle-class groups. China, I think, is not so much, I don't think of it as genocide. I think of it as mass violence, you know, mass categorical violence. Yeah. Yeah.
But as you were talking, I was thinking about how really parallel this theory is with revolutionary theory.
Huh.
You know, when you think about, you know, Theta Skocpol or any of the pretty, you know, well-developed revolutionary theories, you're dealing with, you know, war almost always, organization of the leadership, economic or political instability, weak restraints, high kind of a central position of ideology. There's a targeted group, which is usually a class rather than a group. There's a toxic mass media, I mean, you know, central leadership. This really parallels revolutionary theory. The difference is the group targeted is different, and it may not be mass. You may just give people the opportunity to leave, so you have mass exodus, and then whoever stays, or the dissidents that hang around, then they're targeted. So it's, you know, it's different individuals, but the theory is it's really very parallel.
Yeah, but my sense of that literature is that it's thinking about the importance of war as a way of sort of weakening the capacity of the state, and that creates the condition by which you get these revolutionaries being able to come to power. Whereas in the way in which I see war mattering, which is really fundamental to my story, is threat, right? Is that it's threat drives violence, and so you could have, you know, and so that's, I mean, I have to think through some of the differences, but that's one of the big ones off the top of my head. Yeah. The question of leadership, I think that was the last question. Yeah, so that was a discovery of the work, in the sense that I spent a lot of time in sort of Cote d'Ivoire was my first big negative case, and so when I was doing my work on Rwanda and finishing my work on Rwanda, people were saying Cote d'Ivoire is the next genocide, right? And then it never materialized, and I kept. So that led to the question, like, why not? And so then I started spending time in Cote d'Ivoire, and the more time I spent there, the more interviews I did, the more things kind of came back to this counter-narrative of, like, we're not like that. We're not like Rwanda. Like, people, I would show up and be like, why isn't Rwanda happening here? And they'd be like, that's not who we are. And then they would describe who they were. I'm talking about people on both sides of the political spectrum here. And then I started thinking, well, why do they think like that? Like, where does this come from? And then, you know, it kind of brought me back, and it brought me back to Hufwei. And I was like, okay, well, if it's true that he had an influence, then I should observe. Then I had to say, well, empirically, how can I show that this is true or not? And then I said, well, I can look at his speeches. I can look at what he said. Not only what he did, but what he said. And then I started to collect those speeches, and lo and behold, there it was, right, in black and white. And then I said, well, if that was true for Cote d'Ivoire, then it should be true for the other negative cases, and I should find, by contrast, something different for the genocide cases. And that led me to the that was the late stage project. That was like years 7 and 8 of this research project, was collecting this database of presidential speeches, and it was a way, essentially, of testing whether or not the theory was true, that there were these narratives or these counter-narratives that shaped strategic thinking.
Okay, well, we are at the end of the session. Thank you for excellent questions. Please give a very warm round of thanks to Dr. Strauss.